Welcome to the Managing Violence Podcast, helping to make communities safer by providing education in how to prevent, prepare, respond, and recover from violence in all its forms. Your host is an expert in violence and aggression management. Here is Joe Saunders.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of the Managing Violence Podcast. We are now on Season 3, Episode 3, and today my guest is Mr. Randy King, who is he's an author of several books, and he's also the host of two different podcasts, which are both worth listening to. One is Randy King Live, and the other is Talking to Savages, which he co-hosts with Ryan Rother. I was interviewed just recently for the Talking to Savages podcast, which I believe was actually released. It'll be today, based upon when this is projected to release. So we've got a dual release going with Randy and Ryan interviewing me on the Talking to Savages podcast and me interviewing Randy on this podcast, which you're listening to right now. So I definitely encourage you to listen to Talking to Savages as well. And I'm also going to be interviewing probably next week. I'm not sure when the release date will be, but I'll be interviewing with Randy for Randy King Live, which is actually a debate show where we will be debating. My point will be that physical self-defense, or the ability to physically fight, is the least important part of self-defense. So Randy will be taking the opposing view on that, so that should be quite entertaining to listen to. All right, just a couple of personal notes. Thank you for the patience. We have dropped back to a fortnightly, or there's a 2-weekly schedule for releasing on this particular season, and that's purely just because I am flat out busy. I've been touring around the country, doing different conferences, different speaking engagements, different training jobs. My actual work is going ballistic at the moment, so great problem to have, but it does mean I don't have as much time to get into a studio and record interviews and edit them and so on. So we are doing a fortnightly drop for this particular season. So just to set that expectation for you all, we still have some great guests coming up, but I'll release more information about that as they are confirmed and as they're recorded. In the meantime, I had a great time in Canberra at the Protective Security in Government Conference. I spoke there about workplace violence in Australia and the research project we're currently running on that. Just got back from the Risk Management Institute of Australia conference as well, where podcast guest Dr. Gav Schneider was actually named the Australian Risk Consultant of the Year, which is a tremendous honour and very well deserved. And about to head off next week. Next week I'm at a Department of Home Affairs briefing, delivering some training during the week. And then the following week, I'm back up to Brisbane to shoot some more online learning courses, some more e-learning content. So I'll brief you about that as it happens. Okay, so without further ado, let's dive into the episode. I would be a little bit negligent if I didn't mention that I should give a bit of a trigger warning for this episode. We do sort of evolve into some darker topics. There's a discussion about child abuse and pedophilia towards the end, which was not planned, but it sort of came up as we're talking about scenario replication and the demands upon instructors to play accurate bad guys. So that we do go into that topic. It does get a little bit dark at times, but there's also some light conversation about mentoring, personal development, the industry as a whole, difference between reality and martial arts, etc., etc. So there's a broad spectrum of topics, but I would flag that we do go a little bit dark on a couple of topics. So just use your own discretion when it comes to what's likely to trigger you, or if there's anything you don't particularly want to listen to. All right, let's jump into it. Randy King, author, podcast host, expert self-defense instructor, all-round good human being. Can't wait for you to hear his interview. Let's get into it. Thanks for joining me, Randy. It's great to have you on the podcast, mate. Returning the favor after I was on your show last week. It's great to be reversing roles and having a chance to pick your brain a little bit.
Yeah, it's always awesome. As we were saying before the show, I think that my end right now is the easier side because I just have to say my own thoughts. I don't have to steer the conversation. So the workload is on you until next week when we put the workload back on me for the next podcast we're doing together, because all of a sudden we're best friends or something. I don't know what happened, but we're doing it on a podcast.
We're a duo now. We travel the world doing each other's podcasts and hope someone listens.
Yeah, that's it. I think that's the hope for all podcasts, but exactly what's going on. Hopefully somebody listens to this. Otherwise, we're just talking at each other, which is also a fun time. So I'm okay with it.
Yeah. Maybe we should have seen if the first one was popular before we committed to doing 3.
Yeah, well, I don't know because it's not up yet. So it's up this week coming up. So I'll tell you how it goes. But I'm sure.
Okay.
I'm sure it'll be fine.
Cool. All right. Well, that'll be a mutual drop then because this will be coming out the same week. So we're all good to go.
That's really cool, actually. Awesome.
Yeah. All right, Randy. So, look, you are a moderately profiled guest. I mean, some of us that are deep in the industry will know a little bit about you, and others probably don't know anything at all about you. So yeah. Let's sort of dive in a little bit. Tell us a little bit about what you do, and let's go through your journey a little bit of how you ended up being where you are and doing what you do.
That's awesome. Moderately profiled is definitely an upgrade from where I think I am, so I will definitely take that, especially in your neck of the woods, because you're in Australia, so I'm sure nobody knows who I am there, unless, of course, Rory Miller has mentioned me like he did to you. All right, journey. This is the common question. We were saying this before the show as well, as our journeys are awkwardly similar, Joe and I. So if you've already heard Joe's story, it's kind of similar to mine, but Cole's Cliff's Notes short version of the whole tale is very simply, I was a very heavy kid growing up, and I was bullied like almost every heavy kid was. Saw the Power Rangers, decided, boom, that's what I want to do. Power Rangers don't get bullied. So I joined Taekwondo at about 10 to 12 years old. I think I was 10. Did that, tournaments, got my black belt, whole 9 yards, trophies, everything you get from the Taekwondo experience, the false, I don't want to say false confidence, but the confidence build, all the great things that come from it. And then I decided that at that time, and especially back in the day, that if you're a good martial artist, that automatically makes you a good street fighter. So I decided to get a job as a bouncer. And that's kind of where my story actually begins. So even though I did martial arts for like 8 years at the time, I found that a lot of that didn't work in real life. It's failed me grievously 2 times in my life. One time I was stabbed, and that was the story that's similar to yours, Joe. And one time I was actually in a coma from getting hit so many times. And my instructor was kind of a BS chi artist at the time, and there was no Google to expose him. And I believed his garbage. And so that kind of brings me to where I am now. So I've done martial arts my whole life. I've always kind of been a jack of all trades. I spent most of my time in the Filipino martial arts, primarily Modern Arnis, but I was in the Philippines for 2 months training under multiple instructors. And now I spread the message of tearing the BS away from the martial arts world, trying to take away the Hollywood hokum, trying to take away the traditional stuff, and kind of showing people what a real snapshot of violence looks like in the modern world.
Awesome. So, as you said, our backstory is kind of spookily similar.
Yeah.
I won't share the story, but go and listen to Talking to Savages, my episode where I talk about getting stabbed in a nightclub, and Randy has the exact same story. It's really kind of weird.
I'll creepy.
The exact same story. It's almost like I stole it from him, but I didn't actually know it was his story beforehand. So
exactly.
That's all right. Well, I'll leave that as a plug for your show.
Sure.
Let's go back to that transition from martial artist to bouncer, and talk me through. Like, I mean, I gather you're probably a similar sort of age to me. I was 18 when I started, and so what were your expectations going into that field, and what was those first couple of months like?
Sure. That's a great question. So a lot of my stories sound insanely crazy because of the environment that I was bouncing in. So just a quick backstory for the listeners. I'm from a place called Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. Now, a lot of people think that Canada is a very lovely place, which it is, but there are rougher areas, and my city is Edmonton, notoriously known for being rougher. When I first started bouncing, the oil boom had really, really hit here in Alberta. We have oil to the north of us. So we were importing I don't want to say uneducated. We were importing people that didn't really like school and wanted to work physically hard to make a lot of money really quick, who weren't making the best.
You're a very typical mining town.
Exactly.
In a way. You get a lot of roughnecks. You get a lot of carnies. You get a lot of people with a lot of cash and not a lot to spend it on. So drugs and hookers go down well.
Yep.
Yeah. Same deal here.
Yeah, exactly. So we're a boom town, a mining town, whatever you can link to that. But we were that town. So pretty much when I first started bouncing, the city had swollen in size. It almost, I think it was like it grew 33%, which means the police, the infrastructure in general, the police, the ambulance, firefighters, they couldn't handle all of the things that were happening. So pretty much our rule was from the police, don't kill anybody and don't call us. Like, so we were like, okay, sounds good. So this is kind of our
good rules.
This is kind of our Wild West. Like, we're allowed to do pretty much whatever we want as long as nobody dies. And if we can just not bring it to the police, we're actually helping them out. So we definitely weren't Wild West deputized, but we got away with a lot of things you could not get away with today here in Edmonton now that everything is caught up. And Edmonton settled right down. It's nowhere near as crazy as it was. But why I say that is because the stories we're going to hear coming forward are going to sound ridiculous if you don't understand the background of the environment that I started bouncing in. So transition was the question. The transition from martial artist to bouncer was a very hard one for me, particularly because I definitely drank the Kool-Aid of traditional martial arts at that time. And again, for listeners remembering here, for listeners understanding, this was before Google was accessible on your phone. And so you couldn't just fact check everything. So you kind of had to take people's word for a lot of stuff unless you're going into a deep research mode. And I'm sure, Joe, because you said we're about the same age, I'm 38. I'm sure you experienced this exact same thing when you were taking martial arts.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, growing up, you kind of just believe what's around. And unfortunately, you don't often realize it until after you've been punched in the face a lot.
Yeah, and that's pretty much what it came down to. So my first my two snapshots that I like to use for this transition story is I remember the first fight I got into. So I was the youngest person that joined. I was 18 as well, because again, our stories are weirdly similar. I was 18 when I started, and I was the youngest person on the crew by about 6 or 7 years. I think the next oldest person was 24, 25, and they had been doing this for that much time since they were 18. So I was new, and I was the young guy, and nobody liked me or trusted me. And so they definitely let me learn my lessons by myself without intervening. And so one of my first major incidences when I had to get in a real fight, so not a tournament-based fight without rules, was I fought an old biker. And if you all know who Mark McYoung is, it wasn't Mark McYoung, but he looked like Mark McYoung. Like, so he was shorter than I was. He was in worse shape than Mark is in, but he looked like him. Like, that's the vision if you want to paint the picture. And I remember very clearly, I was younger and more athletic, and I was in shape then. And when he went to fight me, I was dodging and doing all the things you would do in a tournament. And then I remember throwing a punch, and I threw it at his head. Now, the rule set that I trained under was no contact to the head. So when I threw my punch, I stopped hitting him. So I didn't hit him, but I would have got 3 points in a tournament. And I was like, yeah. And my brain went, oh, shit. Like, you need to recalibrate all of your things, like, right now. Well, the guy who I was in the fight with, he was an experienced bar brawler, saw that I had no range, and then just beat the crap out of me with rings. And so that was one of my major epiphanies into real violence is, number one, it's not going to be the way you think it is in training because safety parameters are always the top of the food chain. Number two is, like, there's other things. Like, being hit with rings is so different than being hit by a glove. It was such a different experience viscerally. And also, the third thing that people don't really realize is that most people like to drink and fight. They stink. And I can still remember to this day, like, the BO smell that nobody talks about with this guy. But the BO smell of this guy, like, he beat the shit. I lost that fight. I didn't even hit him once. But I remember being curled up, and he was throwing, like, double lawnmower pulls at me while I was on the ground, like ground and pound style. And the ring sucked, and the hitting sucked, but the smell was the worst part of that entire encounter. And that was one of the things where I was like, man, fighting's way more, it's an all senses activity, and that's not usually replicated in a lot of sport-based stuff. So that was definitely one of my...
That's really interesting. It's really interesting you bring up the smell, because it's not something I've even talked about, but as soon as you said it, I can take myself back there. I can smell what a fight smells like.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting because I was actually bouncing at a time when we brought in, so the state I was working in brought in no smoking laws inside licensed premises. So it was right around the same time, right, where people had historically been able to smoke inside the bar, and now they couldn't smoke inside the bar. And when this came in, like it was right at the time that I started working. And all of a sudden, like I had probably 6 months of like the smoke environment, and then the smoke was gone. And all of a sudden you realize how much everything reeks, because previously all you could smell was cigarette smoke. Yeah. And like, I remember like hunting through the bar even when it was closed, going, man, what smells? And it was the carpet, because the carpet had been like vomit and beer and blood and, like for years, and like it just got a superficial clean till it looked clean, but no one could smell it because it had cigarettes embedded in it. So once that stimulus was taken away, man, everything reeked, and then the patrons reeked, and I mean you couldn't get away with a sneaky fart in the crowd anymore because everyone could smell like everything just smelled so bad, and it took a while to adjust to that. But it's interesting that you mentioned that.
Well, I agree with that. I was so we were a little bit behind. Obviously, we're a little bit behind Australia in the outlawing of cigarette smoking in establishments. But I actually had the same experience. It was 2 years in, so I was 20 when they outlawed smoking. And yeah, the smell was bad, but I don't know if you experienced this. I was never a smoker, but I went through nicotine withdrawal because I was used to being in like a secondhand, thirdhand smoke area for 8 to 10 hours, smoking unlimited amounts of smokes just by breathing. And when they eliminated that, I actually was a super grumpy dude. I was like, what is wrong with me? Why do I feel bad? Why am I so angry? And the doctor was like, dude, you smoked like 100 packs a night every night, and then you just stopped. I was like, oh yeah, I never even thought about that. It was kind of an interesting side effect.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm glad I didn't inhale enough to go through that.
Yeah, I don't know if it's psychosomatic or what, but it was definitely like for about a week, I was like, oh, this is awful.
So you mentioned that you're realizing that pulling your shots for the purpose of scoring and not getting disqualified isn't a good strategy in the street, and you've just been beaten up by a smelly guy. Yep. So what was the transition after that? Like, how did you go about correcting these mistakes? Were there more mistakes to come before you started fixing things? How did that go?
I think there's always going to be, till I'm dead, there's going to be more mistakes. But definitely, yeah, there was more mistakes as I went. So after I got beat up by that biker guy, I decided to stop my Taekwondo training at the time. And I'm still not doing it, so I guess I stopped it entirely. And then I joined a wrestling, kind of like Japanese jiu-jitsu and Thai boxing gym. So I started hard sparring. I started changing everything and doing all the things I thought you're supposed to do. And that actually made a huge difference. So there was a direct transfer over from that kind of hard sparring, close contact, middle ground clinch work and like wrestling that really helped me throughout the time. So I fixed it there. But then the next challenge came, which was the knife story, right? So I had this skill set where, so I was like, okay, so I had Taekwondo black belt, so I thought I was invincible. And then I was proven incorrect by out of shape biker dude. Then I got my ass kicked for about 3 months, getting beaten up. Then I finally got to the place where the other doorman knew I could handle myself, and they would help me out. So with like the Thai boxing type stuff. So then from that's when the knife came out in about 2001. And I got stabbed. And all of my responses were based off of the sport mechanic of the Thai boxing, which did not have any thought process on having a weapon present. So that would be my next grievous mistake in this, was like just understanding that I think the journey that martial artists take is a separate one a little bit, in that you expect that people who learn how to fight understand violence, but you can understand violence and not know the rules of a fight at all, if that makes any sense. So humans are pack hunting, tool using creatures. They like to hunt in groups and they like to use tools. That's what we do. When you go the martial arts path, at least back in the day when I was doing it before FMA, before all those other things, was you expected the person to fight the way that you fought in the gym that you trained at. So when I got stabbed, I was in a Thai boxing / wrestling fight, and that guy was in a kill this bouncer fight. And they were two very, very different things. And as I mentioned, or as people have heard or whatever, I got stabbed in the leg, but the guy was originally going for my neck, and I just lucked out not getting stabbed in the neck. So that was my next mistake, and then that's what started my interest and started my research into the knife-based art. So like the FMA stuff, the Modern Arnis, the Krav Maga, all the stuff that I kind of blossomed into after. That was my next aha point. It's almost like a video game, right? Like I started as a base class, and then I was like, oh, this isn't working, I need to level up, and then I needed to level up again. And that was my next grievous mistake, especially working the door. I've had a ton of knives pulled on me since that point. Not all of them came at me. Not all of them were engaged. Some were threatening, some were non-threatening. But just understanding that people I don't want to use the word fair because it's fair to the person who's doing it. They have their own rule set, but people fight in unexpected ways. And a lot of the way that the training used to be, not so much anymore, didn't really address that.
That's really interesting. There's something I just want to unpack there because you draw an interesting distinction between martial arts and violence, which we've talked about it several times. I've talked about it on my podcast. I know you've talked about it on your podcast. Mm-hmm. But I've sort of started playing with this analogy that combat is a little bit like debate, and I'm just using this as a metaphor, but. If you can debate somebody, that's a certain skill set. There's a different skill set to be able to do public speaking without having to provide counterpoints or be able to listen or be able to create a logical argument. And then there's also just the ability to write really well and to have a good command of language. And I think sometimes we can see this in martial arts where you might have someone who is technically extremely proficient, or someone who has a really good understanding of the psychology of violence and psychosomatic stuff and sociology and criminology and all the back end of why violence happens. And that's kind of like having a degree in English literature. And I've studied a little bit of English literature at university. I can confirm that there are English literature professors who are incredibly boring speakers. But they have a really good understanding of language. They just can't execute it very well. And I sort of see martial arts in the same way. And then you've got public speakers who maybe it's kind of like sparring, where you can exhibit your skills really well and it looks very fancy. But put that person in a live debate where they actually have to respond to potentially unpredictable environments and unpredictable scenarios, and it's a different skill set again. So I've started playing with this concept of treating communication as a martial art, and the more I play with it, the more I see parallels in both directions. And I think it helps me understand the place that martial arts has played in my journey, but I don't really see myself primarily as a martial artist anymore. So it's interesting.
I agree with you. I think you could even add to that concept, like you could be a good debater, but now how good are you at scat free play jazz? Right? Like, can you scat? Yeah. Can you like, no, it's a different skill set, even though it's still coming from your mouth. And I'm definitely of the thought process that humans do what humans do, and then we just do it with different themes, right? So verbal communication, you can mirror that with physical combat. You can measure, like, we're not as diverse as we think we are. Like the same patterns, the same tics, the same reflexes are going to come whether you're an artist, whether you are a debater, whether you are physical, whether you're in a sport. Like you're going to always have these different styles that are going to come from your risk reward center in your brain and just how you're trained, right? Like you could train all day to be Damian Maia from the UFC, and you could follow Damian Maia's program. You could look at his techniques, you could study his fights, but if you don't get the same reward in sparring that Damian Maia got, you're not going to look like Damian Maia when you fight. You're just not. And so human beings, I think we like to overcomplicate things because we want to think we're special and just all these different things. But honestly, I fight the same way I speak, the same way I pursue a love interest. It's all the same pattern. It's different avenues, but my response pattern is identically the same. I have a friend who is a boxing coach, and he can nail your personality. If he spars you for 3 rounds, he will tell you who you are as a person, just in general, just by how you spar. So I think we like to make this overcomplicated, but it's not. You have a certain response tree, and that response tree is going to apply to public speaking, music, fighting. You can get more comfortable, but it's still the same kind of response pattern.
Yeah, that's a really interesting concept. I haven't heard anyone say that before. That's something to unpack for me for sure.
Awesome.
I'm just taking notes, something to research in the future. I tend to take a lot of notes while I'm interviewing people for future study and and so on. So I appreciate that one.
Well, and that's the best part of the podcast, right? The best part of the podcast is talking to other people with slightly different takes. Like, God damn, right? Like, that's a good idea.
Tell you what, this podcast, I think I might have mentioned offline when I was talking to you last time, but one of the craziest things about this podcast for me was just that all these guys that I'd read books from, or I'd watched VHS bootlegs from, or they were just willing to talk to me. I thought, oh, that's crazy. Like these people were like my I won't quite say heroes, because I didn't really get into it until I was an adult, but like people that I'd admired and respected and saw as gurus were just willing to donate their time to have a conversation with me on Skype, which was crazy. This podcast journey has been insane like that. Just on that, how did you end up getting hooked up with Rory Miller? I know we're probably jumping way ahead in the timeline here, but I'm just curious.
Sure. That's a great question. I just drove to a seminar. Like, it wasn't anything special. So after I got stabbed, I actually was going to quit training in general. I was done. I was sick of losing. I was sick of false gods and idols and false models and people telling me I was invincible. So I got really depressed. I wouldn't say clinically depressed, but I was definitely in a funk where I didn't train. I worked out, but I didn't like do anything martial arts based. I just thought like, well, if I'm just big and strong, that'll work well too. And it does. And so, but eventually about a year into that, I kind of wanted to shake the funk, because at that time I still identified as a martial artist, but much similarly to you, I don't consider myself a martial artist anymore. I'm not on the path for perfection. I'm just kind of on a generalist path of safety. So I'm not a martial artist in my own definition of that. But anyways, I was in a bookstore and I looked at a book and I saw a book called Meditations on Violence. So I was like, you know what? I own every martial arts book I can find. So I'm like, I'll grab it. I haven't heard of this. I read it. I loved it. It sparked everything that Rory said in that book. Not everything, but 60 to 70% of the things Rory said in that book hit me personally, where I experienced something very similar to it. Obviously, a lot of the asocial stuff didn't track with me. I wasn't even aware of a secondary type of violence, because I'd spent all my time in the social violence arena, working at bars, etc. And I just loved it. And so because of that book, I built my first curriculum ever. I'd never built a curriculum. I had my gym, KPC self-defense. It was KPC martial arts back then. But I had my gym and I kind of taught like, this is what I would do. Let's do this. It was kind of an open play kind of group. And then after I read Rory's book, I was like, oh my God, I absolutely need to create a curriculum, because I'm not going to remember all this information. And I want my students to have this information, because this is the stuff that I was looking for, that I had to pay blood tax on in order to understand. And this guy has in this book, which is a much, much lower cost for entry. So read the book, loved it, still recommend it to this day. Then I was at a training camp in Tacoma, Washington. I was doing some FMA stuff, and the person I went with found out that Rory Miller was going to be teaching at this thing called Violence Dynamics in Minnesota. So we did a cross-country tour. So like 4 or 5, I think we went across 6 states, all across the northern United States, the central part of the continent. And we met Rory, and me and Rory just hit it off really, really fast. Because just Rory, there's certain things that Rory looks for in people, and I guess I had those traits, even though, and he said this to me multiple times, I'm the only person with my personality type that he likes, because normally he doesn't like salesy type people. So he's the king of the backhanded compliment, and that was the backhanded compliment that I got. But so I linked up with him, I'd say it's probably 7 years ago now, and I was very fortunate. He took me right under his wing. Like he's helped advise me. He's helped build my career. He has been probably the greatest preacher of who I am to everybody. Like if I ask anybody how they heard of me, 70% of the time they say that Rory was in my gym and mentioned you, which is crazy to me. So I got hooked up with him there. I brought him to Edmonton a couple of times, where I'm from, where I have my brick and mortar business. He did. So my gym is weird in a way, because it's primarily, well, it was at that time only adults. Like we don't teach kids classes at all at that time. And it was private lessons and adults. And so we brought Rory up, and Rory got to do his 40-hour core dump, which he always wanted to do, which is 40 hours of all the material he teaches at the time. We got to run that 40-hour course, but of course he was staying with me as well. So I was with Rory for a 40-hour work week plus breakfast, lunch, dinner, etc. So we bonded really well there, and just kind of progressed from that point.
Yeah, that's a cool story, and again, it just goes to show how open this industry can be when you when you mesh with somebody. I mean, I've got a similar experience with Rich Dimitri. I went to one of Rich's seminars, and we kind of bonded in a weird way because I accidentally broke his shoulder on like day 2 of a 4-day seminar. There's a video floating around YouTube of that. I hit him with a haragoshi, a big judo hip throw on a wooden floor, and busted the guy's shoulder. And I of course, felt like the biggest dick in the world because I've just broken the host 2 days into a 4-day seminar. But we kind of, I guess from that he remembered me, and a couple of years later we caught up again, and then I got invited to become part of the team, and like you say, I hosted Rich for a 6-day run, actually six days back to back, which I'd never recommend anyone doing again. We started off with like 30 people, we ended up with like 6 at the end. It was crazy. Like people were just broken. People were exhausted. They were physically broken. But same thing again. We got to hang out. Yeah, before the seminar, after the seminar, lunchtimes of the seminar, and it was good fun, and the growth that you get from that kind of immersion is incredible, and I'm really fortunate that I get to do the same thing now. Where so my Krav Maga instructor is Dr. Gav Schneider, who was on the podcast last week, and Gav is also my boss. The work I do during the week is under Gav as well, at Gav's company. And whenever I visit the head office in Brisbane, I stay at Gav's house. So it's kind of the same thing. Like it's breakfast, lunch, dinner with the boss. I keep his schedule as best I can. He's a maniac. We train, we work, we train, we work, we train, we work, and it's pretty cool. It's pretty cool to have that immersion with someone who is at that next level above you.
Mentorship in general is such an underrated tool that I think people out there should take advantage of. Like if you have somebody in any field, no matter what you do, who is better than you, and you can find a way to be mentored by them, there's just no replacement for it. You can read their book, you can do whatever, but just that back and forth, asking your questions makes such a difference. My friend Paul DiRienzo from Boston, his saying is, do whatever you can to get in the room with people smarter than you. And ever since I've heard that, I agree 100%. If I can do anything I can to get in the room with somebody even one step above me or adjacent to me, but in a different field, there's just no way that's not helpful. Like it's going to make you recatalog, rethink, reprioritize, or even make you think of the stuff that you're focusing on from a different angle. And there's no replacement for that yet. It's not even the internet. It's like there's just something about being in a room with somebody who is good at what they do in your field. It's irreplaceable.
Yeah, there's I live by that saying that you should always try to be the dumbest person in the room. Yeah. Because it forces you to grow, and as much as it's uncomfortable, it keeps you out of that comfort zone. You can apply the same thing to martial arts training. Like if you want to be the only white belt, like you want to be there getting absolutely demolished, because even though you feel like you suck at everything, the progression you're making is incredible, and you won't realize it until you get a chance to roll or to spar with someone who is new, and you're like, man, I'm so much better than I used to be. But it takes a special kind of humility to be able to suck it up and just accept the fact that you're the dummy and learn. But probably actually another piece, because I also am a big fan of mentoring, is that it's sort of gone out of favor. Like it used to be like such an integral part of your human development was that you learned a trade, you had an apprenticeship, and as we've moved away from manufacturing and trades and into a more sort of white collar world, that mentor has kind of slipped away, and people don't stay in jobs long enough here now. Your boss or your supervisor isn't really a mentor, because chances are you're going to be transferred within 6 months, or they're going to be moved to another department, or you're going to quit and take a better paycheck somewhere else, and so you don't really even develop those relationships in the workplace, let alone outside of it. And I think probably the thing I'd encourage people to do with that too is don't be afraid to ask, because like I've been asked a couple of times to mentor someone, and it was an incredible honor. And I didn't ask for any money for it. Right. I was just honored that someone wanted to be mentored by me. And I think there's a lot of people that even people like you say, like Rory, who could name a price. Is happy to help if they like the person and you're not annoying. You'll be surprised who's willing to share some knowledge with you.
Well, yeah, and I think especially like just kind of going off what you're saying in this field particularly, money is seen, how do I put it? Money is seen kind of as a demonization tool, right? So I wrote a book called Selling Out to Your Level of Comfort. And a lot of people think like if an instructor asks for money, they're bad. Now, that's not true. They need to make a living, but that's not what I'm trying to get at. What I'm trying to get at is the good instructors in this field. This is why people are coming on the podcast, yours and mine. This is why getting a mentor in this field is easy, is because the really good people, they just want to make people safer. Money is a bonus. Right. So a lot of people will take you on for free because they're like, oh, you are going to help the world in some way. Let me be a part of that. Like I talk to everybody, like anybody I can talk to. I just had a conversation with somebody from a place called the Diamond Arrow Group trying to get their stuff going. There's enough work for everybody. Every instructor will only attract a certain type of follower, which means proliferating to other instructors helps you spread the message better. And in this field, again, particularly, the really good people just want to make people safer. They all left other jobs. I left advertising in order to do this. Rory was a jail guard, right? Like everybody has different things they switch from. Richard Dimitri walked away from an international organization in order to make people safer and not do combatives anymore. Like the really, really good people, right? The really good people in this field, they want to help. So ask them because they will help you. Simple as that.
Yeah, and realistically, anyone who has longevity in this industry has long ago abandoned the idea of getting rich.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're motivated by the money, you need to pick a different skill set now. Like this is not the industry for you. Yes. If you get to a comfortable living, you probably had to work your ass off for that. So the people that are still around are people that are motivated by something more than money, that they are motivated by that common why of why do we do this? And even if they're not consciously aware of it, they are motivated by that sense of making people safer and sharing knowledge. And so for some people, like I alternate, like I really, at my core, I'm a protector. I've always wanted to protect people. And that's what I enjoyed about working in the security industry and doing close personal protection and so on. And I think I get that from my training as well. But on some level, this is actually entertaining for me. I enjoy learning about it. It's a hobby. And I think that's okay too. Just people are happy to share what they're passionate about. And I just think, coming back to what we're talking about with mentors, I think don't be afraid to ask somebody if they'd be willing to help you out, because most people are. And if they're not, great, move on to the next guy.
Exactly. Like, and that's the thing, right? Because you're all gonna, there's different bars or there's different plateaus in this industry, right? So for me, example, I just had to hire a team because I am doing too much stuff to do by myself. So I was like, all right, I'm at this point now where I'm making a comfortable living because I work my freaking butt off all the time to make that happen. But now I've reached this point where I had to delegate some of my stuff. So example, I don't edit my podcast anymore. Somebody else does that. I don't do whatever. So I can just create and then let people do the dirty work for me. But then that opens up time for mentorship as well. So if you approach somebody and you're like, hey, I'd love to be mentored by you, and they say, oh no, I can't right now, take that right now. Maybe approach them again later on, because maybe then time will free up, right? So don't take, this is old school sales. I'm a salesperson, but don't take that, except in consent reasons for sexual encounters. Don't take that no as a no when it comes to building like a relationship with a mentor, because honestly, if you pursue them, they will see that you want to do something. Joe, I don't know, we've only talked twice, but did I tell you the reason why I wrote my book? Did I tell you at all?
No, you didn't.
Okay, so I have a book, and again, it's on Amazon. I'm not really promoting it; just ties into this. So I wrote a book called Selling Out to Your Level of Comfort, and the book is just literally the business advice that I gave to people all the time who then did nothing with it. So I wrote the book as a bar for entry. So if somebody comes to me and is like, "Hey, Randy, I'd like some help with my business," I say, "Okay, cool. What's your address? I will send you my book. Fill out the worksheets and message me back." Joe, can you guess how many people actually messaged me back?
Yeah, very few.
Very few.
I can guess.
Yes, and you're correct, because look, like the book has worksheets. It tells you everything you need to do. I was tired of having the same conversation. I'm like, I send them the book for free, and they can't even do that work. So a lot of people, if you find a mentor, because you think everybody thinks they're special, but there's some mentors are so burnt out by helping people, and those people do nothing. Gary Vaynerchuk says the same thing. He's like, the reason I give away all my materials is because half of you to 60% of you won't do shit with it, right? It's the same thing here. So if you are looking for a mentor, be aware you have to put the work in. So persistence helps. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think sometimes too, that, as you said, that first no is sometimes just it's a feel out. It's like, well, okay, let's see what you're going to do if I tell you no. Because at some point, someone's going to tell you no. And if you're just going to quit, then why would I bother investing my time and energy into you?
Exactly.
And it's very much like that, again, coming back to a common background of martial arts. Yeah. The old showing up at the master's doorstep and waiting in the cold for 3 days before you get accepted in. Like, that's... I remember when I started wrestling. So I was 15 when I went into an Olympic wrestling club, and I just got absolutely destroyed for 6 weeks. Like the first 6 weeks, I got cardio to death. We're doing obstacle courses, strength work. I was 16 years old, or 15 or 16 years old, and everyone else was in their 20s. I was a big kid, but I was soft, and I had a traditional martial arts background, but I'd never done anything nearly as hard as wrestling. And my coach was a old Russian guy named Yuri. And Yuri, I didn't know at the time, but Yuri had actually been involved in 5 different Olympics as a coach or an administrator for the USSR. So he was a tough dude. And anyway, I just kept coming back because on some level, I think I enjoyed it, even though I couldn't lift my arms after each session. And at the end of 6 weeks, I remember Yuri pulling me up in front of the other members of the class, and he said, I want everyone to give a round of applause for Joe. It takes 3 things to be a good wrestler. You need strength, you need technique, and you need balls. And he has proved he has balls. and that was it. And then after that, I actually started learning stuff, and I just didn't realize they'd been withholding from me. The way he looked at it was he was training guys that were pretty much everyone who was training there was a early days professional MMA fighter, right? So he was training high level athletes, and I was a soft 15-year-old kid. And for him, it was like, well, let's see if he'll stick it out for 6 weeks of being tortured before I bother investing any time in coaching him. And I didn't realize I was being tested, but I was. And I think sometimes with mentoring, we do the same thing. It's like, well, okay, let's see what you're going to do on your own if I say no, and then come back to me. Come back to me in 6 months after you've published an article. Come back to me in 6 months after you've been on a few podcasts, or you've actually contributed something, so I can see what you're made of.
Well, I think that's the thing. Like, the human tail always has a crucible, some kind of thing that you overcome. And as we get, and I don't want to blame a generation or whatever, because it's not everybody, but the crucible has seemed to become a demonization as opposed to the reason to do something. So you were put through a crucible for your wrestling, right? Like, we're not going to show you anything till you prove we're going to show you something. That is unfortunately leaving in our culture, at least here in North America. I'm not sure how it is in Australia, but I know here, like, a lot of people, they just want the answers. They don't want the crucible to get it. And there's an old saying, which is, questions are free, answers always cost. There's a price for answers. You need to go through that to get to that spot. And this is being, I think, washed away now, where people want this instant answer. And so now that people are giving away the answers with no crucible, the answers become invaluable. People don't give a crap about them. Invaluable being have no value, right? Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. And I think that there's such a big conversation here about I guess our generation and the generation that's coming. Everything has been geared around comfort. All our technological advancements are about comfort and ease, and about removing hurdles, removing boredom, making things quicker, making them more efficient, which is great from a productivity point of view. But I wonder what it does to our resilience, and I wonder what it does to our ability to, like, I mean, when was the last time that you were bored? Like, realistically, we can't even go into a post office and wait in line anymore without being, like, on our phone within 3 seconds, because the lack of stimulation is uncomfortable. And I look at, I know North America is a little bit different, but here in Australia, we've had 29 consecutive years of economic growth, which means that there are whole generations of people, myself included, who have never had true hardship. Like, we're not at risk of starving to death. We generally live in a safe environment. I mean, there's pockets like everywhere else, but generally speaking, you're not at risk of being murdered on the street here. Generally speaking, that you can expect the buildings you go into are up to code and that you're not going to die in a building fire. And generally speaking, there's emergency services and free healthcare and all sorts of great stuff. You don't have to worry about your survival on a day-to-day basis. Mm-hmm. And because of that, because we don't function at that level, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, mm-hmm. we're so focused on this belonging and self-actualization level because those other needs are taken care of. Mm-hmm. But what that means is that when something happens that disrupts those lower levels of safety and survival, mm-hmm. it completely destroys us because we have no resilience at that level. We've never had to deal with that. And you compare that, the things we stress over, to what someone in a third world country stresses over, or what someone who is, just a couple of months ago, I was delivering training to a domestic violence shelter, women in a domestic violence shelter, to their staff. And two of the women that were staff in the shelter were, I hesitate to say veterans, but they survived the Sudanese civil war. And they were both young women in their 20s who had literally picked up arms in their teens to defend their village and had to escape massacres and so on. And then they moved to literally the middle of nowhere, like the middle of Australia in Alice Springs. And they moved there and started helping victims of domestic violence. And you think about the things that we stress about compared to what they've been through, talking about hiding in a ditch under bodies for days so that they didn't get detected, and having to crawl through masses of corpses to be able to sneak in to get water and bring back for people. I mean, just unbelievable stress that we don't get to experience now. And our number one stress now is that the latest iPhone update sort of screwed up some of my apps, and now that's going to define my week.
Yeah, I agree. That's a little bit of a slippery slope on both ends. Well, I agree with you. Also, like, there is no bar on pain, right? So, like, your worst day is your worst day, whether you compare it to yourself or somebody else. So if your worst day is you were this poor woman who lived in a ditch and had to hide there, that is her worst day. That is the chemical reaction that comes from that. But unfortunately, the same chemical reaction comes from the worst day of somebody who didn't get the car color they wanted as a kid, right? So while, yes, it is good to point this out to people, we also, especially in the self-defense world, have to pay attention that comparison makes people who are going through stuff less likely to share stuff like that, if that makes sense. So let's say, for example, you have...
I definitely agree. Definitely agree.
And I'm sure you do. I'm just bringing it up to sound smart. But in the situation where, so you come to a victimization service, and you're like, okay, so I have been sexually assaulted, or I'm going to say raped, because sexually assaulted is so elbow to the nipple of sexual assault, where rape is rape. So I've been raped by one person, then you go to a group share, and this person's like, well, I've been raped by 8 people. And then this one person's like, oh my God, why would I even bother sharing if this has happened 7 more times, right? So a lot of people like to pick on this generation of kids because the generation before made it so much easier for them. But there's still a group of kids that are still opting into crucibles where they're becoming MMA fighters or they're wrestling. Like you said, right? There's not a lot of things harder than wrestling. I don't think there's anything harder than wrestling, to be honest. Like, I've done a lot of stuff. I've jumped out of a plane. I've jumped out of a plane. That was easier than wrestling. So
there's a lot of arts that I've enjoyed going back to, and wrestling has not been at the top of the list. Like,
no,
I know if I go to a wrestling class, I'm going to get ground into meat patty.
But so necessary for real world encounters. But anyways, as I was saying, I agree. There's people need to understand there's worse out there, but just because there's worse doesn't mean what you're going through isn't bad. Right. And so while we need to have these comparisons of like, oh my God, this person did this crazy situation, we also have to understand that your worst day is your worst day. And even though objectively their day is worse, the amount of stressors that you experience internally is equal to, if not close to, their worst day. And unfortunately, we just get more resilient at going over crappy stuff. Right. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, that leads to an interesting conversation. I know you're a fan of scenario replication and using sort of quote unquote reality based training methods.
Yeah.
One of the things that I find the I guess one of the more challenging aspects, or one of the most nuanced aspects of teaching self-defense, especially to people that are not necessarily opting in to become a lifetime martial artist, or they don't identify as a combat athlete, or they're just doing the course because they want to feel a little bit safer, or maybe it's been mandated by their workplace or whatever. Yep. Is taking someone who hasn't had that existential crisis, who hasn't had a real threat to their safety ever, and then being able to safely bring them to a level where they can engage in a real a realistic scenario, without completely overwhelming them and shutting them down, but at the same time validating those fears. So do you want to talk to that a little bit about your personal method of how you get through that?
Yeah, sure, of course. So I did. If people want a bigger talk on this, one of my last podcasts was debating exactly this with a guy named Malcolm Rivers. But for this here, it is. I think that everything's scalable. Everything needs to go through, and it always depends on the amount of time you get your client for, right? And so I think you probably do the same thing, Joe, where, all right, I have these people for an hour and a half. What is the most important things I could teach in an hour and a half? Even though there's other things I want to teach, what's the most important thing? But from what I've seen working with, because I work with a very varied clientele. So I work with vulnerable sectors, so sex workers, youth at risk, people, First Nations here in Canada. So Inuit, Métis, First Nations, people that live on reserves where the culture is much different. And I also work with Fortune 500 companies and the other side of the fence, right? So what I'm seeing with this trend is the physical skill set is what puts people in the seats, like learning one quick tip or one trick or whatever, all the garbage that really experienced martial artists hate on the internet. That stuff's what puts people in the seats. But if they cannot control their emotional state, all the rest of the stuff falls apart. So when I teach boundary setting, for example, I have a 3-piece model for boundary setting. It's physical boundaries, verbal boundaries, and emotional boundaries. And I talk about this concept called boundary injuries, where if somebody's had their boundary damaged, teaching them other skill sets without healing or repairing that injury to their boundary becomes almost unimportant. So example, I was on a reserve and I was working with a young woman. She was 16, 17, and we were talking about physical and verbal boundaries. This is before I added my third emotional boundary piece to the model of boundary setting. And I was like, okay, so if somebody wants to do this to you, then you should do this, this, and this. And her response was, why would I fight back? My body has been used by everybody here all the time, whenever they want to use it. So I was like, holy shit. Like, how do you, there's no kia, there's no wrestling move, there's nothing that can beat that kind of conditioning, right? So if people can overwhelm you emotionally, they can beat you both physically and verbally easily, right? They can trigger you into your monkey brain if we use that model. They can scare you into freezing so you can't physically access your skill set. So for me, when it comes to the scenario-based training primarily, working on the emotional side, the only place that really works is in scenario training, and you have to have a couple of safety mechanisms in there. Number one, the person doing the aggressive part, the hostile intent, cannot be the primary contact point for training. So what I mean by that is, if I am teaching somebody privately, if we do a scenario, I myself cannot be the aggressor. And the reason why is if I really give them a true experience of hitting their emotional boundaries, they're going to think, no matter how much I say it down deep, I am really like that. And it will break the trust level between me, the primary point of contact for training, and the person. So when scenario training happens, absolutely you need to have a cast of role players, preferably people that do not train with you all the time, in order to create the best experience for the student, but also then they have their touch point of their primary coach in order to talk them through it. Does that track? Did I lose you?
Sorry, man, I was just on mute still.
No worries. Yeah.
Exactly. I think it's a really interesting point. It's something that I've played with a little bit over the years as well, because finding, especially when you've got budgetary considerations with a client who doesn't want to pay for more than one instructor, trying to when you're doing role plays and scenarios, you can't use untrained people. Like they can't replicate that quote unquote bad guy well enough for the train to be of any value.
Correct.
So I've had to do it myself to make sure it's realistic, but then I have to really temper the scenario to make sure that it's it's not high level. It can't get to that point where it could destroy a relationship. And to be fair, like a lot of the scenarios become just about a testing of, okay, do you understand the principle I'm teaching you? And now let's try and make it a little bit. We always make sure the scenarios are balanced, so there's a fair few that are kind of lighthearted and funny, and they can kind of relate to the off the wall customer or the drunk customer who's not dangerous or whatever it is. But it is a challenge, man, because if you really go full sociopath or full psychopath on somebody, and not only is it hard for the client to pull back on that, but it's also really hard emotionally. There's only so many times you can do that in a day before you are completely drained. And I think people don't understand that until you've done it, until you've put a suit on, or even just verbally, just to access that level of depravity. To really effectively role play an evil person. If you're not evil yourself, it's hard. It's really hard.
I had this exact experience. So we just did Violence Dynamics Prime the 9th year. And so the day 0 for the people that returning clients, we did scenario training. And I guess just to be clear, because English is so subjective, when I say scenario training, I mean a holistic version of, so it's not like situation training. It's not what if I was pinned against a wall. A scenario is an entire experience. So you're armored up. There's verbal components. There's emotional components. There's environmental components. It's as realistic as we could possibly get with still the safety mechanisms. So I was under Rory Miller, who was designing the scenarios, because Rory's very good at designing scenarios. And so we created a scenario specific to that person. And it just happened to roll out that I am the youngest of the instruction team, and I'm also the physically largest of the instruction team. And also I'm the hammiest. So I have the most acty, hammy abilities. So I was stuck in the suit for the last 6 scenarios in a row. And to speak to what you just said, I was emotionally drained. I felt icky. I wanted to have a shower because I was trying to give him the best experience I could, but I had to be a degenerate to do that. And the last scenario primarily was the ickiest one. And the scenario was I was a pedophile that had snuck into the room of one of the people's grandchildren. She had walked in and I had a knife to the kid's neck. And again,
I've done that one. Well, I've role played that one, I should say.
Yeah, it's dark and icky, and I felt gross. And the person who did it, I love. And we picked her primarily because she's such a badass. We knew she could handle it emotionally. So we did it, and I found my own glitch. And what I mean glitch, like some kind of error in my processing, where I knew my goal, what my goal, quote unquote, my fake goal, the role I was playing was I was going to assault this child sexually. But I actually, in the scenario, could not physically say that I was going to do that. It was really weird. So even though I knew I was playing a character, even though I knew that it was to help this person get better and stronger and give them all the identifiable patterns so they don't run into something new in real life, I couldn't actually say I was going to hurt this child. So she kept asking, like, what are you going to do? And even though in my head I was like, say you're going to assault this child, all I could physically say was, you know what I'm going to do. So even I, at this level of trainer, couldn't get deep enough into the darkness to say that I was going to assault a pad that wasn't a real child in any way. But it was just such an interesting scenario to happen, right?
Yeah, it is really interesting. And to be fair, I mean, you have to look at that and go, what's the cost of you going that much further versus how much reality does it actually add? I mean, I 100% agree. I've done a similar scenario where I've role played a pedophile, and that, especially as someone with children, it's so hard to get. Because you want to do a good job. You need to provide a realistic stimulus, but at the same time, you're like, man, what is this doing to me? Like that I have to access this level of evil to be able to replicate it. But but you know what? That's it sounds sort of flippant, but that's what we get paid for. If we weren't doing this kind of stuff, we may as well be sending them to the Taekwondo class down the road. We have to make it real, or else what's the point?
No, I 100% agree. And like you said, right, it was exhausting. Everybody was like checking in on me. Like, I'm like, why are you checking in on me? They're like, because normally I'm always like the chipper, happy guy, but I was quiet, which is odd for me. And so everybody was like, are you okay? I'm like, it just took a toll. It was icky, but I did it. It was worth it. And like you said, right, there was no extra benefit for me to actually say anything. She got the full effect of the scenario, so I didn't have to go super dark, but that was my limit, because every scenario got creepier and creepier, right? So my first scenario was like just like a road rage where I fought a guy. That was super fun. And then, but each scenario was like weirder and creepier. And by the end, I was like, okay, I'm done. Tapped out. No more for Randy. Get me out of this armor. I want to go have a whiskey, chill the fuck out. I'm done with this thing.
Yeah, and I think part of that too is that to really role play effectively, at least for me, I have to be able to access part of my psyche that can relate to the character I'm playing.
Yep,
like I have to be able to find it. I have to be able to find a certain level of commonality to be able to make it a 3-dimensional character. If you can't be just a 2-dimensional stereotypical bad guy, like you need to be able to find a justification, and you need to be able to find everything within you to be able to make this character real. And I think sometimes when you acknowledge that there is a part of you that relates, that's when it gets really like difficult emotionally because you start messing with your own identity to a degree.
Well, that's why actors go insane, right? Like unfortunately I won't put anybody else in this, but we are all more similar to monsters than we are dissimilar to monsters, right? So like, yes, there is a pedophilia is obviously awful, but you are attracted to something and you can't change the thing you're attracted to. So there are some commonalities, even though it's not the same thing. It's still like we have all the same traits these people have, whether we use them or not. I went down a really dark path. I'm gonna lose some listeners here, but I went down a really dark path. So I was researching pedophilia because I was speaking to a group of kids, and they were former victims of pedophilia. And Richard Dimitri has a great talk on this, flipping it like the people who are abused as children, they tend to not be upset when it's happening. They tend to be upset after it stops because of just the dynamic of it. And we kind of have a weird view of this. But I went down the Google rabbit hole, which you shouldn't do, but it's my job. And I got to this place where it was, I forget the acronym, but it's pedophiles who have not committed pedophilia. And it's all these blogs of these people who are struggling with this urge that they can't control, unfortunately, but who have not predated yet. Does that make sense? So
yeah, wow.
Yeah, and so they have like it's I don't know how to put it, interesting, scientifically fascinating, because I read it and I've never felt compassion for a pedophile before because, you know, I have a daughter and I want them off the planet, but they don't get to choose that wiring. It's like one day they're like, oh, I'm attracted to children because I want to be a creeper. That's just not an option. So then it became like this whole debate. I don't want to get into this because it's a whole thing. It's a whole other podcast probably. But they went through this stream of these people confessing, I have these urges. I know they're wrong. I know they're evil. What do I do about this? Where's my outlet? How do I change this? Do I get chemically castrated? Do I get a sex robot that resembles a child? How do I release this urge? And now I'm not comparing them to homosexual people in any way whatsoever, but it's almost the same debate as homosexual people, right? When the church is like, that's wrong. And they're like, well, we don't have a choice. We're attracted to this person. Yeah. So I actually felt empathy for them, which was icky to me, but it's good to look at both sides of the coin when it comes to especially these matters. Like not everything is black and white. Not everything is good and evil. There's so many shades of gray. But the really interesting stat that I saw on that site was most pedophiles, when they predate, if you ever notice when a pedophile is caught, they're like an older person, like 45 to 50. And the reason why the reason why these people say that happens is when you're 18 to 25 to 30, you have like this, I want to be a good person. But almost everybody hits a midlife crisis at 45. They get a sports car, they cheat, or they decide, fuck it, I'm going to die. I'm going to enact my urges. So that was, anyways, it was interesting. Really interesting. Isn't that interesting? It was very fascinating. And again, all this is anecdotal. It's just people on it. But if your listeners are interested in this, you're probably not. But if you want to go down the rabbit hole of this, it's actually interesting to see the other side of the fence of there are pedophiles out there that know they're pedophiles and do not predate, but every day is a battle, and that sucks. Yeah.
You know, one thing I say regularly is that any level of managing violence has to begin with empathy, because you have to be able to see yourself in the offender or in the subject, in the whatever terminology you want to use, but you have to see yourself there to have any chance of de-escalating a behavior or even understanding the behavior.
Exactly.
Even something is like having an empathy for predators allows you to understand how a predator's mind works. But if you shut it off and go, well, they're evil and that's that, then you can't really, you just make yourself defenseless because you're othering them, saying they're beyond comprehension. Well, that's not true. Most human beings are quite predictable. Even people with severe mental illness are predictable to a degree. So I think that there is an element of that of the understanding. And just to clarify something, I'm sure you agree with this. We're not saying that understanding it makes it okay. It's a matter of understanding the full severity of the issue. And look, this again could be a huge topic, but I do believe that while it's very unfortunate for someone who was possibly born that way or has been conditioned that way, there is a certain line we have to draw. We go, well, no, for the greater good, your rights aren't as important as a child's rights, and that's I think that's probably the end point on that argument is that, well, no, we have to agree that at some point what you want or what you desire, what you're struggling with, isn't as important as the greater good and society in general. But man, I think we can apply that same logic in moving away from the icky subject. We can apply that same logic to any form of criminal act or violent act. If you understand, no one thinks they're a bad person. Everyone thinks they're the good guy, and I think that's when I was
not even the good guy, but doing what they have to do. Right? Because not everybody knows they're good. Not everybody's like, oh, what I'm doing is altruistic, but they're like, I'm doing what needs to be done. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. They're a victim of their circumstance. Or we talk about this a lot with war. Is that no side thinks they're on the bad side, right? Everyone who signs up to go to war, if they're there voluntarily, they're there because they think they're fighting for a just cause. Yeah. So, and sometimes that manifests in horrible atrocities, but the intention was always honourable to begin with. Yes. And you can dig into why they thought that was honourable and what social conditioning took place and yada yada, right? But just because our view of who's good and who's bad, or which side is righteous and which side isn't, is the one we're conditioned with, doesn't mean it's the only way of looking at things. And you talk to someone who's grown up on the street. The idea of mugging someone who clearly has enough money to survive because they've got their iPhone 10 and they've got their fancy clothing and they've got they just withdrew $500 cash from the ATM. The idea of mugging that person doesn't seem wrong because clearly they have enough. What they might not realize is that person is actually just keeping up appearances and they've actually filed for bankruptcy. And that was the last $500 they had. But it's still different perceptions because of different learned experiences. And I think that if we shut our eyes to that and go, well, I'm not like them, then we just render ourselves defenseless and we actually make society in general a more hostile place.
I agree. I have two points I want to walk out on that. So number one, the word empathy is kind of loaded because people think empathy means identifying and feeling bad. When I said empathy, or we said empathy for the first icky subject, we just mean put yourself in their shoes to understand. It doesn't make it good or bad. The other thing with the mugging, which I agree with 100%, is affordances. This is a word that gets thrown around a lot, especially with the Roy Miller Chiron group. Affordances just means like what you see as an option for a certain thing. That's your affordance. So I run into this with sex workers all the time. And this was an affordance I had to get over because of just the tool set that I have. So example, if you are a sex worker, a lot of male instructors be like, oh, I would never sell my body for this because of this, this, and this. And the reason why you wouldn't do it is you have other affordances. If you're a big, strong person, you can use violence as a tool to gain resources. You have other avenues. Whereas if you're a small, attractive female, maybe you don't have violence as an avenue. So your affordance is sex work. It's a way for you to make money very easily using your body as you can. So the way that I like to link sex work up with the male side of things, because I have this debate with people a lot, is I think of sex workers, primarily hookers in general, as the same as mixed martial arts fighters. And what I mean by that is they're both youthful people using their body in perceived dangerous ways in order to make a living. Their affordances are just different. The affordance for the young female Does that make sense?
I'm creating a Randy King for that. That quote's going straight on a meme.
I'm sorry, what was that?
I said that quote is going straight on a meme.
Oh, thank you. But it's true, right? Like your affordances are there. And so for me, I'm 6'1", I'm 265 pounds right now. I'm not little. I don't need to my affordance is I'll just go mug somebody and break their legs. But if you're a small human being, right, it's just the same thing. So your affordances paint your environment. And so if you can understand, so not empathize, but if you can put yourself in their shoes, so don't give them whatever you want, whatever your moral stand is on sex work. I have no moral stand on it at all. If you can put yourself in their shoes, okay, look, I'm a 5'2" female. I'm not running around mugging people, right? Sex is my option. That is my affordance.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point to leave it on. And look, we could certainly do many more podcasts, I'm sure.
Sure.
And at this rate, we definitely will, because we've already done 3 in like a couple of weeks. But look, yeah, the roadshow will continue.
Yes.
May as well co-promote. Look, I think let's wrap it up there.
Sure.
I don't know that we're going to reach a logical conclusion to this discussion, because we'll just go all day. Yeah. So let's give you a chance to plug your stuff. Where can people go to learn more about you? Let's talk about your podcast, your books, anything else.
Cool. Well, number one, Joe, thanks for having me on the show, and all the listeners, thank you for downloading this episode. I greatly appreciate it. All the support you can show Joe, please do. He's doing a great thing. So let's support the crap out of this. And then on my side of the fence, so Randy King Live, everything is kind of my profile. So I have a podcast called the Randy King Live Podcast, where we debate topics in the self-defense industry. There are 24 episodes out right now. You can access those on YouTube or anywhere you consume podcasts. I have a seminar tour that I do, so I'm always traveling and teaching and training. I do 30 dates a year right now, so if you want to get a hold of me there or book me, feel free to get a hold of me at randy@randykinglive.com for email. Books, I have a book coming out. It's called Starting at Zero, Your Guide to Self-Defense. It talks about kind of the things we're talking about here, the things you need to understand before you go into a self-defense class, as opposed to the physical skills. And then I have the book I've mentioned 8 times already, which is weird because I never talk about it, but Selling Out Your Level of Comfort is available on Amazon all over the world. It is a business book on how to build a business when it comes to self-defense. I think that's, one more. We have Talking to Savages, the podcast as well. Joe will be on that this week. This week being this week as we record. I don't know when in the future this comes out, but I think it's dropping the same week as Joe mentioned. So feel free to subscribe to that as well.
Awesome. All right. Thanks very much for your time, Randy. I look forward to talking again in the future, whether we're recording or not. It's certainly we have enough parallels that it's worthy having a beer together at some point when we're in the same country.
Agreed. Let's do it.
All right. Thanks very much, Randy. We'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks, Joe. Bye.
Thanks once again to Mr. Randy King for a very enjoyable conversation that really ran the gamut of a whole bunch of different topics. As I said, Randy just interviewed me for Talking to Savages, and we're going to be doing it again on his debate show, Randy King Live. So I encourage you to check out both of those podcasts. They're both worth adding to your violence management / self-defense toolbox of information. Speaking of which, I just want to give a shout out to our latest patron, Mr. Max McGregor, who has signed up as a Blue Belt patron on Patreon. If you would like to get a shout out on the podcast and contribute to continuing the momentum of the show, please head over to patreon.com/managing violence, and you can join the team. Thanks very much, everybody. We'll be back again for episode 4 very, very soon. All the best. We'll talk to you next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Managing Violence podcast. For more information or to listen to previous episodes, please check out www.joesaunders.com.au or visit us on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Don't forget to rate and subscribe so you never miss a show.